John Wayne made a lot of westerns, but a handful of them stand out in his long career. Hondo was one of those films. Hi, I'm Leonard Maltin, and I think it's important to remember what was going on in Hollywood when this movie was made. The 1950s ushered in a new era of westerns for adult audiences. Films like Winchester 73 and Broken Arrow presented tough, often complex characters, and didn't paint its heroes and villains in the black and white extremes of Saturday matinee cowboy films. High Noon and Shane celebrated some Western traditions while questioning others. John Wayne hadn't made a Western in 3 years, but he knew a good piece of material when he saw it. The story was by Louis L'Amour, who was not yet a household name. It originally appeared as a short story in the July 1952 issue of Collier's magazine under the title The Gift of Cochise. He expanded it into a novel, the first one published under his own name, and it became a tremendous success, eventually selling more than 3 million copies and paving the way for a long and illustrious career. Wayne hired his favorite writer, James Edward Grant, to adapt L'Amour's work as a screenplay, and Grant gave Wayne the kind of laconic dialogue he liked best. The treatment of Indians in the story is certainly more progressive than you would have found in a Western made a decade earlier. The character of Hondo is part Indian himself. Wayne's choice of leading lady was most unusual. Hondo marked the film debut of Geraldine Page, who was just enjoying her first flush of success on the New York stage. Hondo may be a far cry from Tennessee Williams, but her performance in this movie earned her the first of 8 Academy Award nominations. She finally won the Oscar for her work in The Trip to Bountiful, made in 1986. This film was made when Hollywood was convinced that 3D was just the thing to lure moviegoers away from their television sets and back into theaters. In fact, Jack L. Warner went so far as to predict that every film would be made in 3D. Filming on location in Mexico, with the cumbersome equipment required for that process, was a trial. Imagine how the people who worked on Hondo must have felt when, by the time the film was ready for release at the end of 1953, it became obvious that the 3D craze was dying. Fortunately, audiences flocked to see this film, not because of its foreground compositions, but because of John Wayne starring in a solid adaptation of a best-selling novel. That's still a compelling reason to watch it today. Like a number of stars in the 1950s, John Wayne was a 3D enthusiast, taking color slides and accumulating this collection, which friends and family could enjoy with a viewer, like this. But making a feature film on a hot, dusty, foreign location in the new 3D process was no fun at all.
Hondo is really a classic Western construction. It's the lone figure coming in, changing things, righting wrongs, learning things, teaching things, moving on.
We made Hondo in 1953. It was a beautiful, detailed script. There was nothing that you would have added to that script.
This was a big production with all the stunt persons, the special effects, the 3D cameras, the language barrier, and watching all this work in a foreign country, I was thoroughly amazed.
The Western is one of the best genres for 3D filming. Hondo's an important 3D film, even though it was released relatively late during the boom.
Farrow is just one of those guys that every time you try to put him in one box, he pops out of another one. He was a poet, he was a sailor, a decorated war hero, an expert on Catholicism, a libertine. He was incredibly smart, just a beautiful writer, and lived a very adventurous life. Hondo is a beautiful film. It's a very beautifully made film. At his best, John Farrow was a really stylistic director. He loved long tracking shots. He loved interesting camera angles.
I'd met John Farrow down at Paramount, and my wife and I had got to know him fairly well socially, and he came by one day and he said, "I'd like you to read this script." This script was called Hondo, and it was written by James Edward Grant. It was based on a short story by Louis L'Amour called A Gift from Cochise, and it was the script that when you read it, you thought, why isn't every script that good?
John Wayne worked with James Edward Grant a great deal. He had a way of writing that fit John Wayne's mouth very well. And Wayne always seems comfortable with Grant's words. So it just seems like this perfect marriage of actor and screenwriter where they each offered the other something that nobody else could.
It was a marvelous
Sus
script.
trailers. Visita mi
Bloody
canal.
beautiful script. I looked in it naturally to see if there's any part that I could play, and I didn't really see any part that I could play. And so we gave it back and said, who will be playing the Indian? Oh, he said, we're having a little problem with that. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, I got a call from my agent saying, would I front up at the Batyak office and have a chat with John Wayne?
They weren't at a studio, but they had a small office-based building just this side of Sunset Boulevard. And I remember auditioning, going there after school, and walking in there and meeting John Wayne.
So I turn up and there's Wayne sitting there with Webb Overlander, who's his makeup guy. Webb put some makeup on me, and he tied put a solid black Indian wig on, put a little bit of a band on it there. And then I came back into the room and they took a couple of Polaroids. And I shook hands with Wayne and left.
You know, I'm 9 years old. And I knew who John Wayne was, and I was very impressed and very excited to meet. Because what kid didn't go to the movies and see John Wayne, John Wayne. So I auditioned for it and went home.
The next day, my agent rang me up and said, I'd like to see you again at Batyak. I said, what for this time? They said to sign the contract to play in Hondo. I said, you're kidding, what part? I said, what part? The Indian chief, you see.
Or the next day, my mom came and got me out of school. It was the last week of school, and says, come on, we're going to Mexico for a month. I go, okay.
Hondo, I think, is a very classic Wayne role. There's nothing really surprising about the part, but I think it does stress something that's a real Wayne attribute, and that is his honesty and straightforwardness.
Said to John Farrow, who was playing it, he said, well, we're trying to get Kate Hepburn, but we're not quite sure of her politics, you see. And Dorothy McGuire's asking for too much, but we're getting, I think, a little girl from New York called Geraldine Page.
But they say that the right two people are going to meet by an arrangement of destiny.
You believe that, Mrs. Lowe?
Yes, I do.
Interesting.
I was told Geraldine Page, a New York stage actress. Now, at 9 years old, I don't know what a New York stage actress is,
In walks this young woman with kind of short, curly, blonde hair. And she walks across and sits down at the table. And she says, is this the Hondo unit? And we said, yes. We said, who are you looking for? She said, I'm not looking for anybody. I'm Geraldine Page. Oh, I said, well, welcome. She said, well, I don't know about that.
Geraldine Page was a kind of an odd man out. I think a lot of those guys held her stage work against her. They saw Geraldine Page as highfalutin.
Later on, she said to me, a day or so later, I'd like to rehearse with you. And I said, Miss Page, look, I'm from Hollywood. We don't rehearse that way. I said, we prepare and we bring our stuff on the set. And I said, then we see what the director wants us to do, and then to get on with the job of acting and putting it on film.
Them Indians you took that pennant off them. Dead Indians?
Finally.
I met Ward Bond. He was sitting by the swimming pool, and I went up, introduced myself, and we sat there, and for a few days, he gave me Spanish lessons.
Ward was a very tough old bird. He'd been around a lot of pictures. He was a person who was a physical person, a rambunctious person. He comes up and gives you a great big bear hug, nearly cracks your ribs for you. But by God, that character that he stuck up on the screen time after time is immemorial.
James Arness, he was in the movie The Thing. And when I was about 8 years old, we went and saw The Thing. And so I was interested. I got to talk to James Arness about that, and that's how I got to know James Arness.
James still had his blonde hair when he came down to play that part of the other scout. Jimmy was one of the sweetest persons in the world to work with. Very casual, very supportive.
And Michael Pate showed up and he's got these like little white tennis shoes on, and a preppy look. And I says, he's Vittorio, you know? But boy, when he got on the set and got that wig on and got on that horse and kind of pulled his face down, and his voice seemed to drop an octave or two. Totally amazing.
Lee, he was just a little kid. He tried so hard. I mean, you know, he did one scene there with Wayne that any other kid might have, you know, been shook by.
My favorite moment is that sequence where John Wayne throws me in the water, and then where she looks up at him and says, I can't swim either. You know, and then she turns and scurries off. John Wayne was a big man, and I'm, what, 4 foot tall, 80 pounds, soaking wet.
Wayne picked him up and threw him right into the middle of the river. Boom, down he went. Down he went again. He went down about 3 times before Wayne, I think, shouted, dog paddle, swim, for God's sake. I
get often asked, did he really throw you in the water? And I said, of course he did. That's, you know, a moment that I'll never forget. It's something that is pretty neat to remember. And John Wayne loved Mexico because he always had boots made and shirts made. And obviously, they loved the sky. That's the reason I understand they went to Mexico, was for the sky. And in the movie, you see all these big, beautiful skies and the changing skies, like the rain scenes where it's all black. And there was a lot of lightning and rain, but it was, you know, what we went there for.
John Wayne, if he hadn't been born where he was, would have probably wished that he was born in Mexico. He had a great affinity for things down there.
Most of Hondo was shot in Camargo, Chihuahua, Mexico. They shot during the summer months in Mexico.
It is desert country, there's no question about it. It was very hot. We shot it in summer, we shot it in about June, July, August, and the temperatures got up over 100.
It was miserably, miserably hot. I think it hovered at 100 degrees or more every day, except for the days when it rained and flooded the place out, and then it was boiling hot the day it stopped raining.
A couple days when we did those rain sequences, they had this huge rainstorm, and when it come in and rain and lightning, and everybody would just kind of hold on to whatever, because the wind was blowing, you'd hold on to a tree or something, or a bush to keep from getting blown away. But you'd stay there for a couple days, and then I'd come back in when the sequence I wasn't in, and be in for a week or 5 days or 3 days, and then go back out there for 2 or 3 days.
We did a great deal of the scenes that I was in on top of what was really a cement mountain. It was a huge kind of mesa, and the only shade on it that you could find was really, I used to sit underneath my horse. They had to bring lights, the big brutes that we used in those days, everything that we needed, a constant supply of those 5-gallon, bottles of water, dozens and dozens of limes which were cut for us to eat all the time. Every piece of necessary equipment, they had to carry them about a quarter of a mile up to that particular place. We had the most marvelous Mexican crew. Never once did you ever hear them complain. We
had a crew of 90% were from Mexico, and they had assistant director, the writers, the art director were all from Hollywood.
The way Wayne befriended the Mexican crew during the filming of Hondo just shows what he was really like, because he loved them and they loved him, and he spent a lot of his time with them, and Wayne was just in his element.
Wayne got on absolutely marvelously with his Mexican crews. I don't think he spoke more than maybe half a dozen words of Spanish, but they loved him. They would have done anything for him. I had to do, my character had to do the beginning of the charge. My horse hadn't been ridden for about a week. He was a big buckskin stallion, enormous, powerful horse. Wayne came over to me and he said, I don't think I'm going to let you do that ride today, Margaret. He said, that Salt Lake is so greasy that horse would never hold its footing. I said, well, look, let me try him. I said, he hasn't been ridden for a few days, so he's going to be pretty full of you-know-what and vinegar. He said, but don't take any risks. I said, okay. So I got on the horse, and I'd say, let's go. Boom. He went like an arrow. I came down, I'm thundering. And as I go past the camera, they say, have you got him? Have you got him? I say, I got him, I've got him. It took me 50 yards or more to pull that horse up. And I could feel someone running alongside me with his hand sort of up my belt and grabbing me and saying, you got him, you got him, you got him. I said, I got him, I got him. And when I pull him up, I just shoo, and the horse sits down his, hindquarters. And I turn around, it's Wayne. He had been running alongside me every damn yard as I went past the camera. And he wouldn't let anyone else do it. I did the ride 3 times for him, and each time, there he was, right? The final scenes of Hondo were really directed by John Ford, not John Farrow. And they were shot by Archie Stout and not by Robert Burks, who was the photographer. But that was of necessity. Farrow had to get back to Hollywood to begin another film that he'd committed to.
John Ford, he was on the camera unit, which was on a lift on the front and the back, and they could put it up 20 or 30 feet in the air. And he was up there with a megaphone and a walkie-talkie, and he was running the show from up there. And it went on for days. That sequence started, and once they started it, they kept it going. If something didn't work, they'd take it all back, keep the cameras rolling, and they'd stop and reload and just go it again. John Ford had this confidence, not arrogance, very confident. He knew what he was doing, knew what he wanted, and knew how to get it. Watching it all work was pretty exciting.
The first public presentation of 3D films in America was in 1915. Edwin S. Porter, who was famous for photographing and editing the Great Train Robbery in 1903, actually filmed 3D with a man named William Waddell on June 10th, 1915, a feature film called Jim the Penman, in 3 shorts shot in the 3D process by Porter and Waddell were exhibited at the Astor Theater. But undoubtedly, the process used to film it and project it was a dual system, as with the 1950s 3D movies.
The original 3D process that Hondo was made in, and that all the great 1953 3D films were made in, was a process which was filmed with 2 cameras spaced slightly apart and then shown on 2 projectors.
By the time Hondo was in production, people in Hollywood had learned a little bit about the 3D process. The Bat-Jack Company, John Wayne and Robert Fellows, who produced Hondo, undoubtedly were aware of what was going on with 3D films early in 1953. But in the 50s, they had some real constraints to make their motion pictures.
It was awful. It was seriously awful the way they went around shooting that in 3D. The camera thing was just so hard to operate.
They were bulkier, so transporting them or moving the camera for certain kinds of dramatic shots were more difficult.
And it wasted an enormous amount of time. If we'd have been shooting with a sort of an average camera, the ordinary camera that everyone used in those days, we'd have probably shot that film in a week less, at least.
Farrow or Wayne or whoever made the artistic decision not to really go nuts with the 3D as some films did, throwing things at the camera, making the audience shrink back and shriek and all those fun things. They simply used it as dimension for the film, and there are a few, an arrow or 2 comes to the camera, a knife or 2 comes to the camera. Sometimes they play with it, but not much.
The gimmick 3D shots in Hondo really are the knife fight when Hondo battles Silva, the Apache, played by Rudolph Acosta, and the knives are thrust at the camera. And then for the climax, when the rifle fires directly at the camera. Otherwise, Hondo's an excellent example of making minimal use of those kind of 3D stunts.
The irony with Hondo is that it was released in 3D, played only for a week, then pulled and flat prints were sent out everywhere. Unless you lived in one of the cities where it first played, you didn't see it in 3D.
The 2D version of Hondo is virtually identical to the 3D version, which speaks well of the filmmakers.
I saw it in 3D, you know, and I remember in the theater going, oh! And if you've ever seen a movie in 3D, it's totally amazing.
And it works excellent as a 2D story in a 3D film. The extra effort that they went to film Hondo in 3D was worth it, and it certainly proved itself in 3 dimensions at the box office.
It's a 3D movie that almost nobody has experienced in 3D.
I learned a lot in Hondo, and I was very glad that I got the experience to do that, but I was very glad to getting back to the United States.
I know I transformed. I went down there as a rather sleek-looking, newly American actor, you know. And by the time I finished up there, I was beginning to look like an Indian Apache.
It was, in many ways, probably a fairly hellish experience. But those kind of memories fade easily enough, I guess. And most people looked back on this with a great deal of relish to have been involved in this film.
If I had to thank anybody for the marvelous career that I had in America, the first one I'd have to thank is John Wayne. I was very honored to be in Hondo, and I thought Hondo was a very good film. The whole thing about it meant a lot to me.
I've worked with Audie Murphy, I've worked with Ronald Reagan, different people, but John Wayne is cat's meow.
John Wayne had his favorites among directors, beginning with John Ford. But less is known about the man he named as his favorite screenwriter, James Edward Grant. We plan to remedy that situation right now.
Douglas, I come close to killing you a couple of times when we were younger. Saddens me I didn't. I could find you in the dark, Mrs. Lowe, and I'm only part Indian. Sticking your head in this bucket will shut you up. First thing I learned about Indian fighting was to wait for daylight.
What has our conversation got to do with Indian fighting?
Indian fighting is good experience for our kind of conversations.
For more than 30 years, he was one of the most successful screenwriters in the business, turning out some 70-odd scripts, both credited and not. His name was James Edward Grant. Born on July 2, 1905, his father was an Irish ward politico, and Jimmy Grant grew up in the heyday of Chicago's rough-and-tumble politics. He decided to go into the newspaper business and became a reporter during the Roaring '20s, covering sports and crime. He always said he knew practically every detective and bootlegger in town.
He covered crime stuff, district attorney stuff, and he wrote a column called It's a Racket, minor stuff, but he exposed little rackets around that would cheat you out of your money. Prohibition, Al Capone, the gangsters, yeah, I'm sure he had something to do with that because he covered the police beat.
He also knew all the best con artists in Chicago. His column was carried in some 200 papers nationwide, and he penned his first novel when he was 27 years old. MGM acquired the screen rights, and Irving Thalberg brought him out to Hollywood.
And he wrote a lot of short stories, and Saturday Evening Post, Liberty, and Collier's in those days. We came out to California, Los Angeles, I guess it was about 1937. I was 3 or 4 years old.
He spent his first month wandering around the MGM lot, where a rival screenwriter observed that he looked like a successful gangster or a shrewd metropolitan detective. He made a point of watching directors and studying film editors at work. He said those were the two most important things a writer has to know in the movie business.
You know, in those days when he got out here, all the movies were made from books and plays and articles and this and that. They were all adaptations.
He was one of those tough-egg, hard-headed newsmen who'd gone into movies after the talkies came in. Guys like Ben Hecht and Charles MacArthur.
I'll give you an example. I don't know, when he was at 20th Century Fox, and this comes from a friend, old Irish friend of his that came out to visit him. And he said, your dad was over there, and he was resisting writing what they were telling him to write for some reason. He didn't like it. He was a hard guy to get along with sometimes. And so they took his office away, and they took his secretary away, and they put him up in a little tiny office way up above. But he'd go to work every day because he didn't want to get fired. And this Eddie Gannon, this Irish friend of his, would go there, and they'd play cards, and they'd drink scotch. And he'd look out the window, and if he saw a light come on at one of the sound stages that they were making a movie, he'd shoot a pellet gun on top of the stage.
1946. Grant has a genuinely good script, ultimately titled Angel and the Bad Man. He's been spending a lot of time with Errol Flynn, but he takes the script to John Wayne instead.
Wayne was working for Republic, and I guess my dad went there to write some of that.
Wayne decides to produce it himself, and Grant coaxes him into letting him direct it. It's their first movie together, and it turns out to be one of Wayne's best.
We went on location to Angel and the Bad Man, made in Sedona. John Wayne and Gail Russell.
Audiences had come to expect a speech or two from Wayne, and as Quirt Evans, he had some of his choices.
This'll sound like I'm butting into your business, and I am. And you ought to give me a watch with a gold case for doing it. You dim-witted nail-bender, marry that girl.
Marry her? Why, I assure you my intention. Well, she knows how I feel.
How would she know? Stop yammering about shoeing horses. That's no way to talk to a girl. Talk to her about her, and marry her. And do it quick.
He's talking about Gail Russell, the girl he eventually marries in the story. Here he's talking to her about his antagonist.
I won't look up Loretta. It's better this way. Every time he opens a door, every time he hears footsteps coming around a corner, Loretta will start sweating, thinking it's me. His food won't set well the rest of his life. Well, all right, but if I'm going to be holy, I got to get some fun out of it.
John Ford was making a movie in the same area. He was making, I think it was My Darling Clementine, with Henry Fonda and Victor Mature. And we went over there for dinner, and it was in a great big tent. And we had dinner, and then they started drinking and talking. And I went as a kid and laid down on a bench to go to sleep, and they were there almost all night. And then they all go to work. It's amazing they got done what they did.
Wayne and Grant found out they got along pretty well together.
Yeah, he and Duke for hours used to play chess. There's so much time to kill between scenes, you know, in the movies. And he's a pretty good chess player, and I hear Duke is a real good chess player. Oh. He was something else. And they got to be real fast friends besides the business, you know. They traveled all over. They traveled to Europe on his boat, and I mean, they were really close. My dad was one of the original partners in Bat Jack. It was John Wayne, my dad, and I think it was Robert Fellows.
Angel and the Bad Man did only modestly well at the box office. Wayne liked the script, but he advised his friend to steer clear of the director's chair. Grant would direct only one other movie after that, Ring of Fear, in 1954, for producers John Wayne and Robert Fellows. Alan Dwan directed John Wayne in Sands of Iwo Jima for Republic Pictures, and years later he said, "Wayne's very simple and very plain, and he seemed to think that Grant was the only man who could put the words the way he ought to say them." Wayne got his first nomination as Best Actor from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for his work as Sergeant John Stryker in Sands of Iwo Jima, and it's easy to see why.
I'm going to tell you something, Conway. I'm going to tell all of you. I'm going to make it nice and simple so you'll all understand. Ben stays here.
Wayne himself told one of his biographers that he liked Grant's writing style. He had a genius for writing simple, direct lines, tailored to Duke's unique delivery.
But a long time ago, I made me a rule. I let people do what they want to do. Curly!
Yes, boss?
Here's the entrance line Grant gave Wayne in McClintock.
Don't say it's a fine morning or I'll shoot you.
Grant knew how to put a little hot sauce on his lines.
I think he enjoyed the comedy stuff. Like McClintock, there's a lot of funny stuff in that. He had a terrific sense of humor, though. He was a funny guy telling stories. He could have a whole table, they'd listen to him and laugh. Irishmen, they all got a sense of humor. He knew stuff about how to phrase Western stuff and the things he used about the horses and the guns, and I mean, he had this knowledge. I don't know where he got it, but it's so authentic sounding, you know.
Drago, I got 1,000 Havana cigars and 12 of those hats for you over there.
Them fair big hats ain't gonna last long the way some folks have been dipping into that red eye these days.
Well, he read. That's where he learned all that stuff. He read. We had always, wherever we lived, we had a library packed with books, and he read all of them. Like the good Western writers, I mean, he has all this background and folklore, and he was a city kid, but we did have a cattle ranch up north. We had a 600-acre cattle ranch in Merced. He had these huge barbecues, with John Wayne and Ward Bond and those kind of guys, Forrest Tucker. Yeah, it was a great life, and I mean, it's something for, he was dirt poor in Chicago, you know. My mother was born in Glasgow, came over here, they didn't have anything, and so he came a long way.
Compact and quick-witted, wiry, with a graying crew cut, Grant was half a head shorter than the Duke, and standing next to him he looked even smaller. But the two men were equal in their respect for one another. They'd both come up the hard way.
He was a abrasive guy sometimes, and stubborn, and hard-headed, and, you know, he'd argue with everybody. Not everybody, but, you know, if he thought he was right or whatever. I remember him having a fit on the phone one day with his agent. He was, you know, he was that kind of guy. He was an Irishman and had a temper, but, you know, he's one of those guys, had all the charm in the world when he wanted to. Tell stories and get everyone laughing and giggling. He used to write real early in the morning. He just wrote as fast as he could think, and with just 2 fingers he could write, and just normal old typewriter in those days before he finally got an electric one. I came home on leave from the Army, so I was off for 2 weeks, and I stayed at home with my dad, and we played golf almost every day after he was through writing in the morning. And he wrote a complete Western script in that time or less. It was done, it probably didn't take him a week, but he used to think about this stuff for who knows how long. That was The Sheepman, I believe. That was the Sheepman script, which was a good movie with Glenn Ford.
Grant's screenplay was nominated for an Oscar in 1959, but the Defiant Ones took it home that year. He wasn't so speedy on The Alamo. Grant put in 14 years on that project, researching it, writing it, and rewriting it.
He'd worked on that script for so long, you know, and he thought if it was nominated for Best Picture, it should have been for Best Screenplay, but it wasn't.
Grant felt writers weren't given their proper respect.
I think writers in his day, though, were kind of just, you know, afterthoughts, you know. I don't think they were near as important as the director. They were just kind of necessary evils.
An irate studio worker once said to him, "Why, you're nothing but a writer." Yes, he was a writer, but Jimmy Grant had a special knack for getting the ring of truth into a script.
All guys make mistakes, I guess, but every one we make, a whole stack of chips goes with it. We make a mistake and some guy don't walk away. Forevermore he don't walk away. So I guess all we can do is just take it and hope we don't make the same mistake again.
In 1966, Grant discovered he had cancer. For the next 6 months, Duke visited him often, having recently survived a bout with cancer himself.
One memory I really remember is the gatherings at the house, the parties, is everybody laughing all the time. That's all they did. And John Wayne, boom, and laugh, shake the walls. And he'd be telling stories, and they'd be telling jokes, and telling stories about people they know, and laughing. So I think they had a lot of fun in the old days, you know. Even when he was sick and dying, he had a sense of humor.
You got a lot of bloodhound in you, Charlie. But you can call off the dogs, because I'm about 5 years smarter than I was a half an hour ago. And if you ever catch me feeling sorry for myself again, you got my permission to belt me right in the nose. Buy you a drink. Lock and load, boy, lock and load.
Grant died on February 19th, 1966.
Being pretty isn't much. I know a lot of pretty people I wouldn't trust with a busted nickel-plated watch. But some others, something comes out of the inside of them, and you know you can trust them.
I remember John Wayne did an interview after my dad died, and when my dad's name came up, he said that was the best friend I ever had in life.
John Wayne liked having people he knew and trusted at his side whenever he made a film. These actors formed a kind of stock company, and a charter member was Ward Bond.
You know the James boys and the Youngers, don't you? Well, more or less, I guess. What do you mean, more or less? You either know them or you don't.
Ready again, Buff?
As I told you, I was born ready.
Gruff, brawny, sometimes surly, always sturdy, Ward Bond was a robust presence in movies spanning 3 decades. A rugged, strapping character actor, both hardy and dauntless. Skilled at playing ruthless villains, he also knew how to handle a sentimental moment and could offer us a tender scene with equal expertise.
No, thanks. I'll go home and see what the wife's doing.
He began in 1929 as an uncredited bit player and ended up in 1960 as the star of his own television series, a top-rated Western. He appeared in some 250 motion pictures and a handful of TV programs. He made 26 films with director John Ford and 23 with his best friend, John Wayne, as well as 8 others with Henry Fonda and 3 with Howard Hawks. He made 6 movies with director Frank Capra, including his unforgettable turn as Bert the cop in It's a Wonderful Life in 1946. Wardell Bond was born in Benkelman, Nebraska on April 9, 1903. He went west in the 1920s on a football scholarship to the University of Southern California and graduated with an engineering degree. At the time, John Ford was making his second sound film, Salute, a football romance set in Annapolis. He wanted to hire the USC football team to bring some authenticity to the field, and young Duke Wayne was his point man. The way Ford told it, with typical Irish embroidery, Wayne tried to prevent Bond from getting on the train to join the company because he was an unsightly loudmouth from a rival fraternity. Ford not only overruled Duke, but also bumped Bond from an extra up to a featured player. In later years, when Bond complained about the unreliability of his profession, Wayne was heard to rebuke him, saying, "I did my damnedest to keep you out of the picture business. You only have yourself to blame." When the movie came out, a reviewer from Variety predicted Bond would, quote, "probably stick in pictures after this effort," unquote. Wayne wasn't even mentioned. That was 1929. Bond was 26 years old, Wayne was all of 22, and Ford was the old man at 34. The friendship of these 3 men would last a lifetime. They made for a raucous, raw-boned trio, drinking whiskey and spinning yarns about their exploits, exaggerating and bragging while playing merciless games of chess, or bridge, or dominoes, and cheating for pennies at poker. They were always ragging on each other and pulling practical jokes.
Figured your scalp would be hanging in some Apache wiki up by now.
Hi, Buffalo.
Been making bets on it. You're sure a disappointment to me, Hondo.
You like to win?
Ford and Wayne enjoyed teasing Bond. Their running gag involved sending him postcards depicting horses' rear ends, inscribed with fond messages such as, "Thinking of you," and "Where's Ward?"
I've known you for 8 or 10 years. You must have a last name.
Well, of course I got a last name. What do you think I am?
I know what you are. There's a lady present.
Ward Bond was John Wayne's best man at his wedding in 1946, and he showed up at the church in a cast. He'd been hit by a car on Olympic Boulevard, fracturing his shin. Doctors started to amputate his leg, but then someone recognized him and they called the studio. His leg was reconstructed and his career saved. Bond was always happiest when he was the center of attention, so within a few days he was reported to be harassing the nurses and plotting an overthrow of the hospital management. Just before shooting began on Mr. Roberts, Bond was married in Hawaii. Duke was his best man, and Hank Fonda was there to give the bride away. She was Mary Lou May, a former secretary in the office of Bond's manager.
I thought we were betting on Sunup.
Why don't you broadcast it?
Wayne said Bond had, quote, all the gall in the world and always spoke before he thought. Pappy Ford, they also called him Coach, was renowned for treating Bond atrociously on the set with constant rebukes and taunts, which Bond endured in good humor. Bond even played Ford, and it was Ford who cast him in The Wings of Eagles. The character wasn't named Ford, but it was a movie director with an armful of Oscars who dressed suspiciously like John Ford and had the last name Dodge. Bond had a blast with the part. After one shoot in the late 1940s, Fonda, Wayne, Bond, and Ford took a private cruise to Mazatlan on Ford's boat, fishing, partying, and landing in trouble in bars all up and down the coast. It wasn't the only time Ford, Wayne, and Bond would go sailing off together. On one trip, Wayne caught 7 fish, Ford caught 3. Bond came up empty-handed, but still managed to get his picture taken with one of the biggest. Wayne never ran out of Ward Bond's stories. On the set, he and Bond would purposely hurl sarcastic abuse at each other, just to make newcomers think they were on the verge of tearing each other apart. But it was all an act.
What'd you hit me for?
'Cause I know you.
Let it.
After his kickoff in Salute, Bond flourished throughout the 1930s with non-stop assignments, often uncredited, but building a solid body of work. 1935 was his most prolific year. He worked on 30 pictures in those 12 months. This winning streak culminated in a blizzard of classics in the year 1939, including Gone with the Wind, John Ford's Drums Along the Mohawk, and in one of his showiest assignments, the lethal John Palmer Cass in Ford's Young Mr. Lincoln, plus 18 other movies. The parts got even juicier in the 1940s, with such films as Ford's masterpiece The Grapes of Wrath, and war pictures like They Were Expendable. During the war years, Bond tried to enlist, but was turned away because he had epilepsy. In 1950, Frank Capra hired him and several other stalwart character actors to recreate their roles from his 1935 movie Broadway Bill. Not only that, he spliced their new footage alongside 15-year-old scenes where they looked essentially the same. Capra knew better than anyone how to bring out the genial mug usually tucked away under that rough exterior.
We got one less horse to beat. Broadway Bill's gonna be scratched.
What do you mean scratched?
Hey, I didn't make this up. I just heard it.
Well, what happened?
I thought I was bringing you some good news.
All right, come on, what happened?
I don't know. The guy that owns him got himself in a jam. He's in jail.
In 1956, he played the inimitable Reverend Captain Samuel Johnson Clayton in Ford's triumph, The Searchers. Other highlights from Bond's long service to the cinema might include his Buffalo Baker in Hondo, The Great Missouri Raid, and Unconquered for Cecil B. DeMille. His last theatrical feature was Rio Bravo for Howard Hawks with his pal John Wayne. When the American Film Institute put out its list of the 100 greatest American movies, there was one actor who appeared in more titles than anyone else, and that was Ward Bond.
I think they're holed up in these rocks. You two boys head around from the north. Oh, wait a minute. Keep clear of those woods. The minute you hear any shooting, why, come on in.
In 2001, he was posthumously inducted into the Hall of Great Western Performers at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. Most Americans knew Ward Bond as Major Seth Adams, star of NBC's long-running hit Wagon Train, exhibit number 1 from the golden age of TV westerns. A star at last, after working in Hollywood for decades, Bond exercised considerable creative control over the series and flexed those muscles on a regular basis. He would clash with his co-stars, sometimes over his ultra-conservative politics. Ford worried about Bond's health, noting that he was wearing himself out with this series. But Bond brushed it aside, saying he never felt better. In fact, he had high blood pressure and smoked and drank too much. Bond had a massive heart attack in the shower of his room at the Baker Hotel in Dallas, Texas on November 5, 1960. He died a few hours later. Ford was on location. He flew to Dallas with 2 other actor friends, Harry Carey Jr. and Ken Curtis, to escort Bond's body and his widow back to California. Bond was put in a flag-draped coffin with an honor guard and flags at half-staff. Carey and Curtis both sang at the funeral. Duke Wayne gave a brief eulogy. "We were the closest of friends," he said, voice breaking, "from school days right on through. He was a wonderful, generous, big-hearted man." He was a big bruiser, 6'3", 220 pounds, ribald and blustery, known to crack open beer cans with his bare teeth. Boisterous, thick-skinned, and egocentric, Bond was always there for his friends. He was undeniably one of the great character actors in the business. The Duke himself put it best when he said, "That's John Wayne in a hit movie of 41 years ago. But Hondo, written by legendary Western author Louis L'Amour, is also one of Wayne's least known movies in recent years. Except for a few isolated TV airings, it's been kept under lock and key. Now it's finally out on video, and I persuaded Michael Wayne, the star's son, to show me the fabled vault where this and other John Wayne goodies reside."
The vaults of the estate of John Wayne. Let me show you around.
Please do.
Well,
this is exciting. This is really great. And here's Hondo. So what did you have to do to get it ready to put on video?
Well, what we did was a complete restoration of the negative. And I mean every single frame of film. They got down with Q-tips and cleaned all the dirt off. My father was always a stickler for quality and always wanted to give people their money's worth, and I guess it rubbed off on me.
Ah, but there are other Wayne movies still sitting in this vault, awaiting revival on video, including the aviation epics The High and the Mighty and Island in the Sky. Michael Wayne promises they'll both be out sometime soon.
Do you get any special feeling when you walk in the door of this vault, Michael?
Well, sure, because I know that it's just full of history. It's full of all the things that happened on all the films. And as you know, the stories behind the film are sometimes a lot more interesting than the films themselves.
And the day I visited, there were some other non-celluloid items to look at.
These are the shafts in here. Okay, these were worn at Stagecoach. They were worn in Red River. And they were also worn in in Hondo. That is the Hondo hat, and that is getting a little bit old, but that's the one that he wore in Hondo. In Stagecoach, he thought that he was going to be able to wear a pistol like he wore in all the quickie westerns, but John Ford said, no, you're not wearing that. You're going to have this rifle. And so he had to carry a saddle, and he had to carry a rifle. He didn't have a free hand, and to work this, you've got to lever a bullet into the chamber. So he came up with this loop lever so that with one hand he could handle the rifle.
It's almost as if John Wayne's spirit was with us in that vault. Certainly the spirit of his image, which still looms large even on a video screen.
Apaches were very tough people who came down on both sides of the Rocky Mountains about 100 years before the Spanish arrived. They settled in a large amount of the Southwest that was unoccupied, and by the time that Europeans moved into this area from the east, they were under siege. It was complete guerrilla warfare. When the Spanish came in and brought in domestic animals, the Apaches were in heaven. They were able to find horses, they were able to ride quickly into raids, run off with domestic stock, sometimes with people, sometimes with grain, whatever was needed. The Spanish retaliated by making raids themselves and taking Apache women, children, and men, if they could catch them, as slaves and sell them down in the mines in Mexico, where lifespan was about a year. When people from the United States came in, the first thing the Apaches did was offer to help them fight the Mexicans because the Mexican War was going on at that time. The Americans turned them down.
We broke that treaty, us whites. There's no word in the Apache language for lie, and they've been lied to. And if they rise, there won't be a white left in the territory.
They won't bother me.
In their treaties with Mexico after the Mexican War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States government agreed to keep the Apaches from raiding into Mexico, which would be very similar to trying to stop the wind from blowing across the border. They did not see why the Mexican government had gone ahead and ceded land to the United States, which belonged to the Apaches. As far as the Apaches were concerned, the Mexican government had no right to turn that land over to the United States because it was Apache land. Nor were we able to stop the Mexicans from coming up in force and killing Apaches in their camps. So the U.S. government was unable to protect the Apaches, and at the same time they were unable to control the Apaches. As the Civil War took place and the military left the area, the Apaches felt that they had driven the Americans out, and they were very happy about this, but they came back. The Central Apaches were to the west of the Rio Grande, and they comprised mostly the Chiricahua Apaches who are in this movie. These bands would have different names. Victorio's band were the Membrinos, who were living in the Mimbres Valley near Silver City, New Mexico. Victorio was an extremely fine general. He really knew how to get his people into a battle situation and out of it again with as few people lost as possible. Victorio had developed a really strong belief that the Americans could not be trusted. The Apaches, not having large bands, tended to split the Americans into various groups. There were the blue coat groups who lived in the forts, and there were the rancher groups who raised cattle, and there were the mining groups who dug holes in the ground. These people were not seen as the same people, even though they spoke the same language. So you could be at war with the military and not particularly be at war with the ranchers, or you could have a blood feud with the miners and not have a blood feud with the people who had farms. It was frequent that ranchers would have friendship with individual bands, and those bands would more or less vouch for those ranchers, and the ranchers would be allowed to continue to live in relative peace while other ranchers or miners would be being shot on the other side of the mountains.
There's trouble brewing in the Apache lodges. The Torio, their main chief, called a war council. Full report of it's in that dispatch I'm carrying.
But you don't know, we've always gotten along splendidly with the Apache.
Generally, women could not manage on their own without at least one man helping them. On most of the ranches, they had a crew of cowboys or vaqueros, depending on whether they were from Mexico or from the United States. Even a woman alone with a child would have a series of hands who worked for her. It would be very difficult for a woman to live all by herself out in that country without help. That's why you needed to have either a band, as the Apaches did, or you needed to have a ranch complex, which is why Victoria was worried about this woman. He didn't think that she could survive out there by herself, which is probably true. It wouldn't be necessarily that the Apaches would kill her. The country itself was pretty lethal unless you had a lot of help.
You a fool. Your man dead. Soon come planting rain. If your man come home by then, good. If not, you take Apache brave.
Girl children were more important because they were less expendable than boy children. The women basically owned everything except the men's horses and their saddles and their weapons. The women owned the wickiup. The women made the decisions when the men would go to fight, or when there needed to be a raid, or when they needed to go hunting. The government made the mistake of wanting to talk only to the men, whereas as a matriarchy, the Apaches had to go back and talk to the women before they made very firm decisions. Your mother was the person whose clan you belonged to. Your father's clan was a clan that you were associated with, but you were born into your mother's clan, and therefore had a duty to that particular clan. There were a lot of men who were killed. They lost a lot of children. And because of that, they would raid far more children, more women, in hopes of keeping the numbers of the tribe up. Apaches were much more interested in having children and mothers who were tough than they were in worrying about where they came from. They figured that they could turn them into Apaches pretty quickly. What they wanted were tough kids who would survive.
I learned to make them when I was living with a mescalera.
You lived with the Apache?
5 years.
And you had an Indian wife?
When it came to marriage, for a man to leave a woman is very difficult because he is attached to her family at that point. Whereas for a woman to leave a man, all she has to do is throw his saddle outside. By the time that people from the east came into the Southwest in any number, the Apaches were very firmly set in a terrorist society in which raiding was one way of making a living. A raid was a thing where you wanted to go into someone else's area and take a large amount of stuff that you could use for trade somewhere else. The most successful raids were where you went in, you took what you needed, you left, and no one knew you were there. A war party would be going out to avenge some sort of an insult or someone killing someone else's relatives. Under those circumstances, you went out with no desire to bring anything back. The idea was to kill people and scare everybody else into going away. Apaches preferred to kill people from behind bushes, under rocks, wait for them to come into water holes. There was no display, there was no glory involved. This was guerrilla warfare of the grimmest type. They were indeed as fierce as any group of people that ever lived in their defense of their homeland. The chase scene in Hondo is very entertaining, but is not an Apache war tactic at all. They would have waited at some narrow spot where the wagons went through, where the Apaches were up in the rocks above the trail, and would have attacked from the sides of the arroyo from the rocks, chasing a wagon. Wore out your horses and might get you hurt. The first federal fort systems were put in prior to the Civil War. The forts were put in strategic locations, generally along roads where people were going to pass so that they could defend travelers. And they were put in places where reservations were going to be. And almost immediately there were disagreements among the military and the Apaches. The military wanted to condense the Apaches in as close an area as possible so that they could control them, whereas the Apaches were used to living in over a broad area with not very many people close together. When you concentrate people like that, you end up with a lot more sickness. You end up with a lot more people who are going to get mad at other people. You have a lot more friction. The military and the government in Washington tended to lump the Apaches together as Apaches, whereas the Apaches were not a cohesive group. And if you made treaties with one group, that did not mean that you had made treaties with other groups. And no thought was taken to how these people were going to live, how they were going to make a living. Money was not set aside by Congress. These people had to eat. They would go from being in very good condition with plenty of horses, plenty of things to eat, to actual starvation because no food was being prepared for them and they were not allowed to go out and hunt off the reservation. They were not allowed to raid, and no one was bringing in cattle to them to eat. So people would go into the winter with virtually no food. The Apaches did not understand why the Americans would make agreements which they would very solemnly sign and then completely ignore the fact that people were starving to death. They were simply told that they would have to live there, and if they objected, they had the choice of trying to run to Mexico and escape or simply being chased until they died. Victorio did finally come into the reservations and tried to settle down, and he realized that if he were ever arrested, he would never get out of jail alive. At that point, he decided that he would leave the reservation and make a run for his old home. In the movie, he is killed in a charge against the patrol of American soldiers, a thing that Victorio would never have done. Victorio would not have charged into a group of soldiers under any circumstance. He was really killed in Mexico by the Mexican army, basically with a large number of Tarahumara Indians who had tracked him down and figured out where he would be. Victorio's sister Lawson went both on raids and war parties with her brother. She was considered to be a very famous person with a great deal of what was called war medicine. She knew where the enemy was and what they were doing. Victorio actually got killed at the end because Lawson wasn't with him. The Mescaleros, the Western Apaches, were left on the reservations. The Chiricahuas were rounded up en masse and shipped to Florida. Every one of them, including the Chiricahuas and the Apache scouts who had been assisting the army during the whole thing. The fact that you had been a person who had worked in the military, the American side, did not even count. They were all shipped to Florida, where a large number of them died. They were then shipped to Arkansas, where a number more died, and eventually had a choice between going to Fort Sill in Oklahoma or back to the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico. Geronimo stayed in Fort Sill. The Chiricahuas were treated much more harshly than most of the other Indians in the Southwest.